Good afternoon, good morning, good evening to everybody. I think we are hosting this this session today. It's a global session. I want to welcome you all. My name is Boris van Westering. I will be acting as the moderator of today. I'm a climate journalism development expert working with partners fixing the information ecosystem related to climate change. And this is one of my activities. And secondly, I try to support organizations to become more sustainable themselves. So all into the climate work. Today, we will do the impossible. We have 4 fantastic speakers in 3 different time zones in the US, Brazil, and Germany. Presenting research followed by specific case studies and share some practical takeaways on how philanthropy are engaging in the climate change domain, and all in 1 hour. Amazing. I hope that you can bear with us during that time. And during this hour, we hope to tackle your questions that you post prior to this session. So I hope that it will be reflected during this hour. Of course, you can pose your questions within the chat and preferably also address it to one of the particular speaker. We will try to answer them. And if we can't answer them now, maybe we can do it at a later stage as well. And if all went too fast, don't worry, it will be recorded. So the session will be shared on the socials of the 3 organizations. Then, if you still have questions and you are very much triggered to speak to one of the speakers and reach out to the organizations, these wonderful speakers will reveal their identity soon to you and share the emails or ways to contact them. So feel free to reach out. Now let's start. Our first speaker, Catharina Malmgren, from the Center of Effective Philanthropy, is asked to set the scene, let's say the higher level, and present the key findings of the report, Much Alarm, Less Action. Catharina Malmgren is an associate manager of the research at the Center for Effective Philanthropy, where she facilitates data collection and analysis on a wide range of topics in the philanthropy, including foundation strategy and funding nonprofit relations. The Center for Effective Philanthropy, for those who are not familiar with them, is a nonprofit organization based in the US with a mission to provide data, feedback, programs, and insight to help individual and institutional donors to improve their effectiveness. That's a lot of work. And wonderful work. But my question beforehand, Catharina, is could you perhaps introduce yourself a little bit on how you ended up in philanthropy and climate change?
Yeah, of course. Thank you, Boris, and thank you everybody for joining today. I'm really excited to be here. So my journey to philanthropy, I've actually only worked professionally in philanthropy for about 3 years now, but nonprofits have played an important role in my life, at various points, guiding and helping me along my path. And so when I found the Center for Effective Philanthropy, I was really, attracted by their mission to help donors, as you said, very broadly, and the impacts that can have on nonprofits worldwide. And so that is sort of why I'm at the Center for Effective Philanthropy. And then, as you mentioned, we really do research on a broad range of topics relevant to philanthropy. And the research that I'm going to present today is our first project on climate change and climate change philanthropy. So we are not specialists in this field, but we recognized, the magnitude of the climate threat and its intersections with all fields of work, and thought it was very important to do a study on the perspectives of foundation and nonprofit leaders.
Oh, fantastic. So I think the study came out last year, right?
Correct. Yes, it was last summer.
So it already went out and reached some of the audience and people.
Yes, I mean, Alice reached out to me after our webinar, so I know it's reaching some people, I think, in the climate spheres particularly, and really our goal is to continue with that outreach and especially try to reach more foundations and donors who are potentially interested in climate philanthropy, but not involved yet or don't know how to get started. So yes, the outreach is going well so far and something we're continuing to push on.
Oh, wonderful. Just a little disclaimer before you start, because I ask you to squeeze the whole vast, rich data that you have collected in a very short time to present. So you will zoom in and take out some of the highlights, and that doesn't mean that all the other data and information is to be omitted, but I will take us with you on the roads in this journey of your study.
Great, thank you, Boris. Yes, I will share my screen, and as Boris said, this is just a couple of the data points from this report, and I think we will share later the link to the full report if you're curious to read more about anything that I share today. Okay, so first I want to touch a little bit about the purpose of this research and what questions we were specifically seeking to answer. So first off, we wanted to answer how pressing of a problem is climate change from the perspective of foundation and nonprofit leaders, and how do they think climate change will affect their work? Next, what are nonprofit and foundation leaders doing to address climate change? And lastly, how are leaders of organizations that do not focus on climate change thinking about this issue? So before I dig into all those results, I just want to share very briefly about the methodology for how we sought to answer these questions. So we surveyed leaders of US-based foundations and US-based nonprofits in early of 2022. As Boris said, we are a US-based organization, so we decided to focus our initial efforts on the US philanthropic sector. And as we fielded these surveys, we really emphasized wanting to hear the perspectives from both organizations that do and do not focus on climate change, to be able to include the views of those who are not already engaged in some type of climate work. So it may be the case that some leaders more concerned about climate change are more likely to respond to our surveys, but as you can see in this table here, we did get a good mix of responses from both those organizations that do and do not address climate change in their work. So with that background and context for the project, I want to turn to one of our first key findings. The foundation and nonprofit leaders in our sample overwhelmingly see climate change as an urgent problem that will negatively impact the lives of the people they seek to serve, especially historically marginalized communities. As you can see here on this chart, most leaders told us that climate change is one of the top 3 most important problems to address right now. So, given that these leaders see climate change as an urgent issue, whose role do they say it is to address it? Well, the foundation leaders in our study said that all sectors, the public sector, the private sector, and the nonprofit sector have a role to play in addressing climate change. As you can see here in this chart, leaders see the public and private sectors as playing a more significant role than nonprofits and foundations. However, I think it's very important to note that most foundation leaders say philanthropy can play a role that is unique and meaningful. As one foundation leader in our study said, philanthropy can and should be a first mover that sets a good example for others to follow and can influence public policy and for-profit businesses to do the right thing. And I'll be interested to hear from other panel members today whether they're seeing any compelling examples of foundations taking advantage of their unique position to try risky or unproven strategies, or to convene and collaborate to really help build momentum and build up movements. So while the leaders see climate change as an urgent problem and believe that it will ultimately create more extreme conditions that affect their fields and their communities, of course, not everyone is engaged in this work. And among those who are not, the most frequent reason they cited for why they do not fund climate efforts is that it's simply not a part of their mission. Written comments from some of these leaders suggest that the climate threat is still experienced as abstract or far off. Among other top reasons funders say they do not fund climate change, 39% said that the board had a limited interest in or willingness to address climate change. And 35% said that the problem is too big relative to their foundation's resources or their geographic area of focus. Now, on a more optimistic note, this study did surface some openness to addressing climate change from those who are not currently engaged in this work. 45% of those leaders have not closed the door on the possibility of funding climate change. These leaders said they'd like to better understand the connection between climate change and their areas of focus. They expressed interest in more information, including opportunity to learn from other funders and help for building up board support. And I think some of the really rich examples that we're going to talk about today and those strategies are just the type of resources that some of these funders are looking for. Turning now to those foundations in the US who are already engaged in climate work, their efforts are still relatively limited in terms of their grant dollars and investment practices. As you can see here in the first two bars, the majority of the US climate foundations in our sample said that their climate funding is less than 20% of their total grant dollars. And when it comes to financial investment practices, among all of the foundations in our sample, 31% said that they engage in some type of climate-related impact investing, and 22% said that their foundation prohibits investments in fossil fuels or other carbon emitters from their investment portfolios. Yet, it is worth noting that among this subset of funders who have divested, none reported at the time of the survey that their returns had underperformed benchmarks that include fossil fuels. So at least for this group of funders, they are not seeing that trade-off between financial and mission objectives. And lastly, while assessing the effectiveness of anything foundations or donors do can be challenging, and it may be particularly so in this case, given the scale and the scope of the climate change threat, the leaders in our study do not think that foundations or that their efforts to address climate change have been particularly effective. But they do have many suggestions for how philanthropy can be more effective in combating climate change. First and foremost, they underscore the need for more focus on and more funding for climate change, of course. But beyond that, almost 60% of foundation leaders said funders should do more advocacy through their grant making and through the use of their voice. They suggest more public policy engagement and more support for organizing. As one leader said, the scope of the challenge exceeds the power of the programmatic grant. The work needs to be public policy focused. Leaders of climate organizations also urged funders to take more collective action, to collaborate more and better. One said, all of us on the funding side need to coalesce around this issue for it to have traction. And finally, leaders also emphasized climate justice. As one said, to save all of us, we need to ensure that those among us who are most vulnerable and those who have been most historically excluded from prosperity be included and uplifted in a new vision for a post-carbon world. So I just want to close by saying that our hope is that this analysis of hundreds of foundation and nonprofit leaders' views can spur foundation staff and leaders and boards to candidly discuss climate change and its implications on the people, communities, and issues that funders and nonprofits focus on. And while this is CEP's first research initiative on climate philanthropy, we're really hoping to continue this conversation, including at our upcoming conference this fall in Boston, where we will be having a session on the future of climate philanthropy. So thank you all for listening. I will stop sharing my screen here and bring us back to the panel.
Well, thank you so much for this interesting oversight. Were there some elements that surprised you when you were analyzing the data? Is it like, was there some kind of wow moment, or like, oh, I didn't expect this to happen?
Yeah, I would say there were a couple. One that I'll highlight is we actually asked everybody if they were having conversations either at the board level or with their grantees, with their nonprofit organizations about climate change. And more than half said that they were not, or they had not had any conversation at the board level or with their grantees about the implications of climate change. And to me, that seems like a very logical and reasonable first step. And I was a little bit surprised that that number was as low as it was. And so that I would say is one of the surprising results from the data that I didn't already share that I think is ripe for future opportunities.
Well, thank you so much, and well, stay with us for the Q&A, and if later on, if the audience here at this session would like to also ask a specific question, they can definitely do. And I think I noted also your question about the risky strategies that might pop up in the case studies. So maybe we can, or the other speakers can later on also look at that question and take it on. Well, the power of collective action is well represented in the contribution of our next speakers from WINGS, Alice Amorin and Amanda Lima. They will zoom into some of the cases of the Philanthropy for Climate case studies reports. So I would like to introduce you first to Alice. Alice is a Brazilian lawyer and a climate politics analyst. She coordinates the Philanthropy for Climate movement at WINGS and has been working for a decade in the field of climate and sustainable development with a strong focus on civil society and non-state actor engagement. Amanda is a Brazilian political scientist and sustainable development specialist. She is a research consultant supporting the Philanthropy for Climate movement in developing the case study publication. I think I have been reading these case studies and I have been in awe. It's all very interesting how so many philanthropy organizations have opened up their toolbox basically and give you this unique insight. So it is very interesting to see. So I would like to, but before we start into the presentation of your report, maybe Alice, I met you at the COP 27 in Sharm el-Sheikh, and it was quite an interesting meeting. And it was at the same time when there was a radical political change in your country, which might be considered as a boost for the country in terms of climate change and putting it back on the agenda. And maybe it's too soon to call, but did you already see some kind of change going on with new doors opening for philanthropy in Brazil?
Hello, thanks very much, Boris. Thank you all for joining us today. Yes, I do see, and I think it's that's one of the reasons why I think Brazil could be an experiment of what is the capacity of global South philanthropies to lead some of the implementation of climate action that we need to see very fast. We all know that governments are bounded by the time, by constraints like their budgeting capacity, their flexibility, the political dynamic of the countries. But philanthropies are very much well positioned, I believe, and I've seen many of those cases and other cases that philanthropies can navigate those very much very wisely and really make an impact. That's why, at least for me, I have been seeing and following philanthropy in the past 10 years almost, not only in the climate space, and I do see that this is going to happen. My note on this is the G20 will be a good testing ground. We have in Brazil the G20 and COP30, hopefully coming in. So let's see how much philanthropy, Brazilian philanthropy can deliver.
Okay, well, thank you for your comment. And maybe before starting this your presentation, I assume that everybody knows WINGS because all of you within the philanthropy community, they seem to know you, but for those who don't know you, is that WINGS is a global community of thought leaders and change makers who are committed to ensure philanthropy reaches to its fullest potential. So the numbers are huge. You have a lot of members, 200 in 59 countries. You're the United Nations among the philanthropy, and you represent almost 100,000 philanthropic actors. So chapeau. Can you take the floor? And I think you will do this in a duo presentation. So Amanda and Alice, please take the floor.
Myself, great. Thank you, Boris. And let me put this here. So I assume you can all see that. Before I jump into the case studies and give you what I think most of you are really here to listen to in terms of the details of the cases, I just want to remind for those who are not familiar with the Philanthropy for Climate movement, which is the umbrella movement in which WINGS works on climate at the moment. So as Katerina said about CEP, WINGS is also new in the climate space. We actually started working on climate about 2 years ago, back in 2021, pretty much also as a result of the provocation and the incentives from our own members. The Philanthropy for Climate movement that is one of these laboratories of how can we better use the capacity of philanthropy support organizations to engage on climate, to engage in the different crises that we see the world facing at the moment. So from 2019, when one of our members, ACF, actually launched a UK Founders Commitment on Climate Change, until now, we managed to move with some of our members, with Philea and others, from 7 foundations to 622 foundations spread in 23 countries that have committed to act on climate. This movement is a pledge. So we have a family of pledges that belong to the same movement, that some of them, as you can see there, are actually nationally focused, and we host at WINGS the International Philanthropy Commitment on Climate Change. What is new about this movement, and why are this case study so relevant for us? The movement wants to primarily target non-climate and non-environmental foundations. Precisely some of those that Katerina just mentioned, that potentially haven't excluded the possibility of funding climate or engaging on climate. How can we help them move from one idea or one commitment to action? So this is our main goal. It's also actually to expand this broadly. But how? How can we help those foundations to understand what they should be doing? So this case studies is one of the several resources that we are putting out there in the Philanthropy for Climate website, and I definitely encourage you all to access the resources section. So before jumping into the cases, I want to pass it on to Amanda, my colleague, who was a great support to this work that we are presenting today. Amanda, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Alice. Hello, everyone. I'm Amanda. I'm the Brazilian researcher behind the study, and I'll briefly present the methodology to you of the case studies. So first, we conducted a desk review, right? And to analyze different secondary sources to get a broader picture of what has already been published and documented in the field, in the philanthropy field. And we were really amazed by the diversity of documented climate journeys, like regardless of maturity level of the journey. So, but we really missed Global South Foundation's stories. And also we noticed that there were few stories of philanthropy climate work boosting institutional and also network changes, right? So to address this gap, we decided to highlight in our sample the cases of non-traditional environmental funders and cases of funders from the Global South. we wanted to investigate further the diversity of paths taken to integrate climate into philanthropy, right? So during 4 months, we interviewed different representatives of different types of foundations to understand their journey, their climate journey, and to better correlate it with the pillars of the international commitment, right? So the majority of the 20 philanthropic cases that you guys will see in the publication are from the Global South, and 60% of the cases portrayed the climate journey of founders historically focused on education, democracy, housing, among other cross-cutting issues. And although our research sample and scope limits do not allow broader conclusions about the field, it brings valuable contributions. And I think by showing the current diversity of the climate journeys in philanthropy, we end up reinforcing the idea that there is no better time for philanthropies, right, to act on climate than now. I think when the field is really flourished, right? And Alice will further address the findings in this. So thank you, Alice.
No, thank you all and thank you, Amanda, very much for that. So I think one note is important of what Amanda said also is that this idea of testing the pillars of the international philanthropy commitment on climate change. We wanted to see, based on the stories that we heard, if when organizations that commit to act using those pillars as a driver, as a framework, if that would be useful, if that would reflect the reality in place. So I'm bringing to you 2 cases that I think it was really hard to bring 2 only out of 20, but I think these 2 are interesting for 3 main reasons. One is that in this spirit of trying to put in a box, okay, this case is relevant for programmatic strategies and how they can mainstream climate. This was the hypothesis we had when we started. But in the end, we realized that we could tick many other boxes in the pillars of the international philanthropy commitment. There were also cases of advocacy, cases that were looking into the investment strategies, cases that would do a lot of education. So I think it's for us, it was also a learning journey to understand if we want to look into philanthropy's capacity to impact, to change the field in a holistic way, we need to really bring this whole approach of the field. So Alana Institute. Alana was founded in the 1990s with a very specific focus. They work on defending children's rights. They started very small, looking into a community, a vulnerable community in São Paulo that had a connection with the family of the founders and pretty much addressing the immediate needs of those children. From that very small investment, they started to realize that the problems or the scale of action to engage on children's rights had to grow and had to touch upon things like the healthy environments in which they live, so the health conditions of children, the consumerism that was severely impacting children's quality of life overall, and from the poorest to the wealthiest. And in this process, in this journey of understanding the different elements of their strategic work, they realized climate, it's everywhere. Climate is part of, it's impacting everything we do. And how can we, or what are the main, let's say, ways forward in which we can look into the climate without losing sight of our identity as a children's rights foundation. So in this process, they have tested litigation strategies, and Johannes, I think, will touch upon litigation in the future. Advocacy at the national, local, domestic, national, and international level, such as their efforts to bring a Children's First coalition to the COPs and to the UNFCCC process. They have really embraced this very crunchy element, which is when we talk about youth activism or youth-led rights as part of the climate conversation, we are not necessarily bringing children as part of that. So we need to unpack this. And this is one example of, let's say, integration that I think it's very interesting to look also from another last element of this case, which is they belong to a family of philanthropies with the same group: Alana Institute, Alana Foundation, Alana Lab. This is a common feature of collaboration that also Katarina mentioned as a critical element. Each of those foundations or philanthropic institutions in the same group touch upon the issue with a different lens, from investments to push for more coherence from their endowments, and others more on the programmatic side. So using all the instruments that are at hand. The second case I wanted to bring is from the Trottier Family Foundation. They are based in Montreal in Canada. Very low profile overall. I don't think many of the climate foundations usually know that they're doing a tremendous work actually on divesting their endowments, pushing for more climate friendly or climate coherent the investment sector in Canada. They actually started in a longer journey than Alana and than most of the organizations. Actually, about 10 years ago, they started funding here and there different climate projects, mostly precisely translating one of the commands that Katarina mentioned, which is public policy focus. What can philanthropy fund in terms of research, in terms of advocacy, in terms of instruments for civil society that could help shaping the domestic climate policy landscape? Always with a market-friendly, or let's say a low-carbon economy transition in mind. So from those potential like one-on-one or standalone investments until now, they have grown tremendously and very much aligning their endowments and their whole capacity to shape the financial sector there, and the suppliers. Like one of the interesting examples that they mentioned is that, okay, we decided to divest, but we didn't have the capacity in our asset managers and our funds to reinvest those resources. So we need to work with those communities, those intermediaries, to do something. And lastly, on the Trottier case, it's interesting because they do believe philanthropy has a role to play on that, and a strong one. So they also invest in supporting the philanthropy support ecosystem as a strategic lever for more philanthropy engagement in Canada in particular. I have several others in the cases themselves, other takeaways, other provocations of reflections, but I just wanted to bring three here. One is that we do need to discuss more the concept of climate philanthropy and how we measure it. I think most of you maybe already agree with that or think about that. And I don't want to push us to the problem of climate finance concept conversation, which is a never-ending case. I do think it's just that those cases, for instance, are not part of the 2% report. Wonderful report. I every day thank ClimateWorks for putting that out there, but it's not there. So what's going on in the climate philanthropy landscape is much more than that. We need to have spaces like this to discuss with different inputs, different players, pushing the boundaries to understand what that is. The second point is the transformation that is underway in the philanthropy sector goes way beyond the investments in climate-specific projects. We tend to evaluate how much philanthropy is doing just by looking at their grant making. But the transatlantic shift that is needed to really incorporate or mainstream climate in a holistic approach of a philanthropy is huge. Some of our cases show that from deciding to fund climate to actually doing something, they basically rebuilt the whole data system of the philanthropic organization. So we really need to bear in mind our sense of urgency, but what's the kind of work that it takes to mainstream climate action across the board. And the last is that the wealth of climate advocacy strategies is huge. Our pillar on the pillar 6 in the International Philanthropy Commitment text, it doesn't really reflect everything that is going on out there. So please use those cases to test, see, and get to know those different strategies that are very interesting. The cases are there, they are being uploaded, and I do welcome a lot of your feedbacks, critics, suggestions. Thanks a lot.
Well, thank you so much, Alice and Amanda. Thank you for the presentation and sharing of your the cases. Although there were only 2, there are 18 more to read. There was one question from Catherine McDonald related to the research, I believe related to the youth, because the question was also about if the research covers eco-anxiety of youth. Any thoughts, Alice or Amanda?
Not that I recall on this. I think this is something that Jane Kabuchi here, I see her, she can tell much more about that. But in our case, I think, no, unfortunately not.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's something to consider, a very important topic actually to take on. One question that was also asked by Katrina, did you come across any risky strategies that were taken, like more of a avant-garde kind of approaches of philanthropists?
Wanna come in, Amanda?
No, I was thinking out loud, but I think a lot of them take big risks. Not only the ones mentioned by Alice, but I was remember cases from the MENA region, for example, that we really see climate's not such a priority issue from the philanthropic field, but also they are really struggling to discuss these issues with grantees, with boards. But I'm not thinking one specifically. I don't know if you thought about one, Alice.
Yeah, I do think it's actually this, if you look at this litigation strategy from Alana itself, it was quite risky, actually, in a space where the shrinking space for democracy is on the threat. You go to litigation in the courts, it can be very risky. So the political context in which those foundations operate really matters a lot on the level of risk-taking and ambition of those foundations. But yeah, there are some risks there. I suggest people to go look at it in detail.
Okay, well, a better bridge you couldn't build, Alice, to our last speaker of today, of the session. His name is Johannes Lundhausen from Active Philanthropy, and he will be joined by his colleague Luis. Johannes provides Active Philanthropy the scientific focus on climate change issues. And before joining Active Philanthropy in 2020, he worked with the German committee Future Earth, the German Society for International Cooperation, GIZ, and Berlin Social Science Center, covering climate and sustainability issues with a joint focus on science and policy. And for who you don't know Active Philanthropy, you're based in Berlin. It's a social enterprise and aims to protect the planet for future generations. The recently published Spotlight on Climate Funding Strategies is the latest public output of this work. I believe that I should also mention your name, Luis, because you have been an associate researcher also in this study. And I salute you on behalf of everybody that took part of it. Very interesting read, I think yeah, fantastic to do to absorb. But I think maybe then also a question to you both, and maybe Luis, you can start. When you made this report and you collected this data, what did you make you proud about this outcome? You know, the wow moment, or when you thought like, wow, this is really something that yeah, this is a beautiful outcome of this report.
I think it was great to see all the partners and foundations that participated, and we really want to thank all the 21 foundations that shared their experiences with us. So it was great to see all of them combined on our website.
Yeah, well, fantastic. And Johannes, and for you, what was for you the thing that stood out for you, that you thought like, this is an absolute wow moment?
I mean, thanks for the introduction, Boris, and welcome to everyone here. Thanks for coming. I'm not going to say which one is my favorite case study, because I can't. It would be like preparing apples and pears. But what I will say is really the variety of the funders that we have included, and I'm sure it's the same with WINGS output as well, is great. It just really shows how different the foundations are that have found their own role within climate philanthropy. You know, it ranges from very small foundations that work very locally, say on conservation, employing a certain strategy, to, you know, big foundations with international programs that fund networks and big advocacy campaigns on the EU level, for example. So it's really this variety that stands out, and it also shows that I think it is possible to define that role no matter where you sit in the philanthropy space.
So yeah, well, thank you for that clarification. And Johannes, maybe let's dive into let's say the report. It's not a report. It's you mentioned it. It's rather a practical toolkit or a learning guide. I let you label it yourself.
Right. Thank you very much. So it is not a report. It is more of a toolkit. We've called it a spotlight. So I'd like to put the spotlight on climate funding strategies to add something to the things that have been said before. I mean, thank you, Katharina, also for setting the scene and showing us the great potential that still exists in terms of bringing more funders on board of this climate philanthropy journey. And I think if the people who are listening are part of the 45% of funders who are still open to engage in climate philanthropy, you might be asking yourself some quite important questions. So it might be, where do you want to fund? What issue is most pressing and maybe also close to your heart? Or also, when is the right time to engage? But another question is also, how do you want to fund? And I would like to put the spotlight on that, on the funding strategies that really cut across the different issues of climate change that you might engage in. As Luz has already mentioned, on our website, we've included 21 case studies of funders and foundations across Europe, but also some from the US, who were kind enough to share their wealth of experience in employing certain funding strategies with us, but then obviously also with you and with other people who can't be on this call today. And a great thank you to them. I can't really do justice to what they've shared, to all the lessons they've learned and that you can read up on our website. But what I can do is to give a short introduction. So let's have a look at how climate funders typically work. Let's say they work in 3 ways. They influence decision makers. That means they harness typically the force of government and of parliament to instigate change from the top. And that's a crucial piece of work, and includes certain funding strategies. Advocacy, strategic litigation have already been mentioned. One issue where this is important, and is something that's shared by one of our case studies, Giving Green, is the decarbonization of heavy industry. And Giving Green, in the case of Giving Green, really shows that governments are crucial here, because they set carbon procurement policies for the public sector, but they also set regulatory frameworks, and they assist corporations who are ready to transition to a low carbon state. Another way is by empowering civil society and local communities to take matters into their own hands. And that typically really means for them to be able to define solutions that fit their local context. And that can range and look different for different foundations. So it can range from covering the costs of, say, even meeting spaces, all the way to doing capacity development and training people on their media skills, for example, to be able to share their own stories more strategically. And last but not least, funders also innovate solutions. Often that is through research and development, through developing knowledge in science, but also helping to develop new technologies. And the Röchling Stiftung from Germany is one example of this in our guide, and they have really helped to scale research results by developing an eco label for recycled plastics, so that industry can engage in sustainable procurement. If you're interested in that, I can refer you to our website. And also generally, if you want to look at the 10 funding strategies behind these spheres of impact, please have a look at our website and check out the case studies behind it. But if you do go to our website, I want to give you a little example of what to expect by looking at the aforementioned strategy of strategic litigation, which is part of this influencing field. What we have done, the way we've structured the case studies, is by always talking about the rationale, why it is important for climate, for fighting climate change. We've included many examples of grantees and practical projects. We've included the expected results that you might want to see when you're engaging in this funding strategy. But we also included references to what that actually looks like in funding practice. What do you do if you engage in this strategy? And strategic litigation as a funding strategy for climate really means to support legal work that brings social change with an impact beyond one individual court case. And the rationale here really is to call out polluters, maybe private corporations, but also to call out climate inaction, for example, by governments. And it's been a very successful funding strategy recently, and there are many examples. One prominent one is maybe the one from Germany, where youth-led coalition succeeded at the level of the institutional court to call out the not very ambitious emission reduction aims of the German government. And that success at the Constitutional Court led to an immediate policy change and an increase of ambition in terms of the target that the German government wants to reach by 2030. Another recent case in Norway, an NGO-led case, has shown us that it's not just about successes, but it's also about failures that can be turned into successes for strategic litigation. In this case, the NGO was filing a court case against the Norwegian government, and specifically against drilling practices in the Arctic, and they lost that case in front of the court. However, they succeeded in changing public perception on these drilling practices, and also in soliciting international criticism from UN agencies of those drilling practices. So these two examples really show that strategic litigation can lead to different policies to shaping and also sometimes to enforcing climate law, but it can also mobilize the public. So now, if you are a funder that is interested in strategic litigation, what do you actually fund? Typically, you would fund either an individual court case, but you could also find capacity building amongst lawyers, amongst activists, amongst even scientists, to bring their experiences, their expertise to the court in regards to climate rulings. Maybe even closer to the funding practice are two questions that we really wanted to put a focus on in the spotlight. And that is, what has worked well and what are opportunities for new funders? Now, the two case studies that we are very grateful for regarding strategic litigation are the one of the Children's Investment Fund Foundation, CIF, and Agenda, an operational foundation from the Netherlands. And they have shared with us what has worked well with them and what they think that could be particularly interesting for new funders. What has worked well for them and what they recommend is to start small, to really focus on concrete problems and bring them to to court, for example, the development of a new flight path of a local airport, rather than immediately taking up the big international corporations. They're also, and I've touched upon this before, recommended to connect this funding strategy with other funding strategies to really bring out the potential. And that is what also the Norway case comes back to, because without public engagement, without communication, this lost court case would just have been a lost court case, but in the end it wasn't. It was a success in terms of public engagement. And one other important thing to keep in mind is a court's scope. So typically courts cannot define legal standards, but what they can do is they can assess if existing legal standards are implemented properly. And in regards to the opportunities for new funders, there are two interesting takeaways. One is to expand strategic litigation more to corporate actors. So strategic litigation has been a very successful strategy to call out inaction of governments. And there are seminal cases in the corporate world as well, but there's a big potential to take this further and use this in the private sector. The other one is to support activism, and particularly to ensure the legal representation of people at the front lines. So activists or people who are involved in civil disobedience as they are facing court cases themselves. So if you'd like to learn more about these cases, but also about other funders and what they do, what funding strategies they employ, and the lessons they want to share with you, I can only recommend you the website and encourage you to continue reading there. What you can really find there are practical insight by those 21 funders, and I certainly have found them really inspiring in terms of rethinking funding strategies, and also to think about new partnerships to engage in. So if nothing else, have a look at the website, and also by all means get in touch with us if you have any questions. Thank you.
Hey, Johannes, thank you so much for this insightful presentation and practical, some highlighting some practicalities of cases. And one question that I had also, what it struck me, and it's also a question that was posed by some of the people from the audience prior to this session, is you mentioned also frontline people who are at the front line, and have you seen in particular also, and we talked about youth and people that are most vulnerable to climate change. Do you see philanthropy moving also ahead more in direction of supporting women-led organization, but also in incorporating women-led solutions in combating climate crisis? And is that something that is in particular also a trend that you have seen?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I mean, I think it definitely is, but what I can share from the case studies of this particular work is that there is across this funding strategies a strong focus of seeking to include voices that have typically not been involved in discussions. So that can be women in certain cases, but it can also be people of color or otherwise marginalized communities. And that is really something that came out strongly. It's not just in one particular funding strategy, but it's really across all of them, across political advocacy, where people say, okay, we need to empower those who have not been in politics before, but also in terms of capacity building, we need to really focus these strategies on people that have not been involved before, but also in terms of, for example, networks, where it's been highlighted by one of our case studies that the amplification of those voices is much easier if you're in a network, if you're standing together and trying to get a message out together.
No, thank you. Maybe Alice, could you also react on this particular topic, and also about maybe indigenous people and how they are reflected in the programming? And maybe you can link up with another question that was also asked by the audience that was particularly interested also in the geography of the cases. In particular, do you see also particular examples in the African continent?
Sure. Yeah, I just mentioned that one of the cases we documented, I think it's particularly useful both for women-led strategies and also to indigenous communities, is the Alliance of Global South Funds, which is actually an alliance of 8 funds, if I'm not mistaken, all that were created in different countries of the Global South, mostly in Latin America, but also in Africa, that were trying to make a kind of activist philanthropy, they call it. So activists that decided to embrace the activity of becoming philanthropists themselves and using social environmental funds as the instrument to really get to the ground, to really get to the community. So people that really come from the community to design like a bigger picture strategy and fundraise with, let's say, this capacity, which we know that it's a common constraint, like for funders that want to fund in the Global South. How would you know what are the priorities there? How does the localization agenda meets the climate priority? So this is, I think it's an interesting case to look at. In Africa, we did have 2 cases, very interesting ones. One is the African Climate Foundation, which is actually a regranting organization that was founded 2 years ago, and it started in South Africa, but actually it's present in, I think, more than 13 countries, not physically, but with different strategies or different interventions. And they are, I think, bridging the climate and the development narratives and prioritization very well. So the whole idea was that how can we use our power to connect with global networks, global funders, global prioritization with a strong local understanding of the strategies and the priorities. So this was one foundation that really was born as a climate funder, and it's progressively or understanding what is development as part of that. The second one is from Nigeria, and it's an interesting example of advocacy that is, let's say, lowering the bar in terms of understanding the climate conversation to get to a bigger domestic political shift. So they explored a lot the strategies on entertainment, producing films, really working on the awareness raising at the domestic level to progressively bring climate as part of their work with this political support.
Thank you so much. And maybe I would like to move to Katarina, maybe that I hope that the answers of the other panelists was about the examples were risky enough for you. And maybe you have something that you would like to add to the conversation. And maybe as a closing remark, or maybe closing round, we could take let's say the eco-anxiety of the youth back again, because I misread a little bit the question. But how I read that question, maybe now it's more about, are the communication frames which we are using right now the most effective one in getting all these younger people and youth on board, and with the risk of them falling out of the climate action domain because they think it's a helpless future in which they will live anyway. But maybe going back to Katarina first.
Yes, I think the examples that were provided around some of the advocacy work were very powerful examples of, a field that sometimes foundations are a little bit nervous to get engaged in policy advocacy. So I think these examples that you all provided, whether it's about litigation or narrative change, I think are very powerful examples for how foundations can create a larger movement. And so, yeah, thank you. I'll stop there since we're short on time.
I would like to invite either Amanda, Luis, or maybe you have a comment or reaction. Do you have, or something that you would like to add to what we previously said? No, and maybe yeah, please go ahead, Amanda.
No, I was just reinforcing.
Okay.
I think we are set.
Okay, good. Johannes, maybe something to say related to the narrative and communications. Did you have a particular takeaway on that? And maybe this will be a final round because we will run out in time, but I will hopefully be able to get this final round done.
Yeah, thank you. So, I mean, communication as a funding strategy is interesting because a lot of foundations and funders are actually quite versed in communicating and communicating their own work, which in itself, I think, is a way to amplify what you're doing. But to use it as a funding strategy is something different. Again, it's about sharing, funding others to share information and also to make information accessible, to build new narratives, to also shaping norms and values of those who are receiving that information. And I think one of the important questions around all these funding strategies is always a little bit, who are they for? Whose priorities do they fit with? Not every funder might come to the same funding strategy in the same way. So I think communication is particularly one for funders who, for example, are concerned about misinformation. There's a lot of misinformation, and especially in the climate development of climate policy, there's been a lot of misinformation historically, and we see backlash all the time in different countries. So for funders who are worried about that, I think this is a good place to go. It's also a rising topic in the communication space. And also generally also for funders who want to increase the relevance of climate knowledge. There might be scientific knowledge, it might also be the knowledge of indigenous people around climate change or ecosystems. And for those funders who are interested in creating new stories around that, I think communication is the strategy to go.
Alice, maybe a final remark.
I think it's very encouraging what we are seeing in terms of there are several foundations and philanthropies trying to do something about it. We need to know more those stories and facilitate the circulation of the information of those stories. So somehow the same point on communication that Johannes brought in. I think this is key. This is key in the Global South. So it's not only about English speaking content, but everywhere with different ways. So it is a hard time to document, for instance, experience in China. We do have one of the cases in China, but also Indonesia. We are trying, and I think philanthropy support organizations have a role to play, academics as well, but others in the infrastructure, if we are really key to get this movement to a scale, not only the philanthropy for climate movement, but the philanthropy sector to move. I think we all know, I mean, there are several people calling this, it's time to move, we need to be urgent. So let's use all the assets we have out there. And I think philanthropy support organizations are important assets that haven't been doing. Research is one of the things that we can do. What else? I hope you have other ideas and provoke us all to do more. Thanks.
Well, I think this is a very good way to round up. I think also this this session, because I think we've in a way we touched upon the different motivations for philanthropy to enter the domain. That maybe some are still resisting or sometimes don't know where to start. Others, they want to do more. So it is a but what stands out is the networking element and finding the nexus between your core core activity and connected to climate impact that might also take you further away from your core goals, and finding those nexus and that's I think one of the things that was at least my takeaway when I read your documentation. And be bold. I think the ones that are saying we have to put our money now, not for in 20 years. Let's do it now. And I think in the collective, I have to also salute all the philanthropies that are also here in the audience that took the time to be with us. Also the organizations that are very close in connecting with them, because I think making the alliance between civil society, state, non-state actors, individuals that have a passion or an idea to make things move, because it takes only one person to move something. So the way is to, and I think philanthropists are, I think, and it shows also in the cases, they are very flexible in setting up new innovative funding strategies. So thank you so much. I've been talking too much. I would like to take the opportunity to thank everybody that have been part of this 1 hour travel through San Francisco, I think Rio, right? Or is it Sao Paulo? And
Rio.
Rio, of course, and to Berlin. I thank you so much. Today is Mother's Day in the Middle East, so I salute all mothers. Today, I believe, is also the start of Ramadan, so Ramadan Kareem for those who are practicing. And I hope that this is the start of a learning journey that WINGS and Active Philanthropy and the Center for Effective Philanthropy also together can continue this wonderful journey. It was a pleasure for me to be part of your journey, and I hope to see you all again in another moment in time doing impactful work in support of climate. So I hope that you have a wonderful end of day, start of day, or midday. Till next time.
Thank you very much, Boris.
Thank you.
for your
Bye-bye.
work.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Take care.